The wild of the Yu-Gi-Oh market. What is the wilderness of the Yu-Gi-Oh market? Why do we find this concept so interesting and appealing? How big is the wild? Does it even matter from a collector's perspective? Let's talk about this and more right now. So before we dive in and start talking about the wilderness of the Yu-Gi-Oh market, if you're new to this channel, please feel free to drop a like, comment, subscribe. We cover all kinds of interesting questions and topics related to the vintage Yu-Gi-Oh market and other collectible asset categories. So let's start with our first question, which is, what is actually meant by this term, the wilderness or the wild, in reference to the Yu-Gi-Oh market? So since the early days of human history, people have always been interested in assigning a label for things that are unknown. Dating back even to some of the early maps from ancient history, right? You often hear folks talk about the term, "here be dragons," right? Or some other term that's used to describe basically territory or regions or places that have not yet been explored, aren't really well understood, and nobody in their circles of communication really understand what's out there, who's out there, how big it is, or how dangerous it is, right? This term of the wilderness or the wild or the unknown, choose your term of art, right? People use different ways to describe the same concept, which is essentially the entire unknown marketplace for vintage Yu-Gi-Oh products. So typically, a lot of different collectors or card stores or sellers out there in the market, in this ecosystem, will use this label of the wild to describe pretty much anything that's unknown to them, which is to say, there could be a lot of stuff out there that isn't yet on the radar screen for many collectors, and so a good term of art to use for it is basically just the unexplored, uncharted territory of the Yu-Gi-Oh market. So I think it's pretty self-explanatory what the term wilderness or wild typically entails when it comes to just general terms of art. So let's speak first off specifically about what the wilderness is in the vintage Yu-Gi-Oh market. So in my opinion, the wilderness is any inventory that's out there. Could be sealed product, right? Could be raw cards, could be binders, could be other memorabilia or vintage collectibles. Anything that's out there that's inventory, stuff, right? Original vintage stuff that was printed in the OG era, 2002 to probably 2004, 2005. All this old stuff that's out there, but is not yet recognized or categorized, which is to say, this inventory is unknown, right? It's not, number one, formally recognized or graded inventory. So it's stuff that PSA or Beckett or the other grading services have not yet gone through the exercise of grading and authenticating and all that sort of stuff. But I think in addition to that, it's just stuff that's unknown. So it hasn't been listed on eBay yet. It's stuff that hasn't really been discovered or rediscovered, or it's stuff that just hasn't yet been introduced into the formal marketplace. And by formal marketplace, I mean basically places where today's collectors would be able to buy and sell or access or even have visibility into that inventory. I'll give you an example. There's a person, some kid that had a collection from 2002 to 2004, had a whole bunch of raw cards in a box that were kept in that box off market, off eBay, not sent to PSA, completely off grid, if you will, for almost basically 16 years. Then in 2020, in this particular case, I was the collector. I decided to open up that box again, look at what I had, and now I've started to formalize that inventory. I've sent a lot of it off to PSA, and so on and so forth. So that stuff is now on the market, but was previously just in the wilderness, completely unknown, completely just off the radar screens, if you will, of anybody that was monitoring or tracking the market. There are several high-profile examples of the wilderness in the Yu-Gi-Oh market. The most immediate one that comes to mind is the Cyber Dragon, right? The parallel rare from Mattel that just showed up out of the blue, out of the woodwork, just appeared, right? On Reddit, somebody posted something, I think, a couple of months ago, and then they got it graded, right? And I think it graded a PSA 6 or whatever. But unbeknownst to the collector community, these things actually apparently exist. And pretty much everybody out there had thought for many years that these cards were not actually real. It was just something maybe that Konami had on a blueprint. It was something that was supposed to be in production, but never really hit the shelves, or for whatever reason it wasn't out there, or they all got destroyed. There were a lot of theories about it, but nobody actually had recognized or even seen these cards since 2006, or whenever it was allegedly supposed to be in production. So that's a very high-profile example of something that had been out there in the wilderness, unknown to anyone out there. You couldn't buy that thing. It wasn't even visible in the marketplace. Nobody knew it existed. And then it all of a sudden shows up and rears its head in the open market, right? That's an example of something coming out of the wilderness or the unknown. Another very high-profile example of the wilderness in this market, there's anecdotal evidence that several years ago, somebody broke open a storage unit or something like that and discovered just boxes, like possibly a pallet or several pallets that were packed with the Magic Ruler boxes, right? And so this person decided to sell a lot of those, obviously, when they discovered them. And so a couple of years back, the Magic Ruler sealed boxes were pretty easy to get your hands on. There were a lot of them, I guess, available on eBay. I wasn't very active in the market, so I'm just leaning on hearsay and allegations and things that people have said. But that's another example of stuff that was sort of off-grid, off the market, that just suddenly appeared and kind of changed the game from a collector's perspective, because if you were big on Magic Ruler, you were probably a little either happy that there was more inventory out there that you could now buy up and maybe grade a 10 for your collection or add to your binders. But if you were somebody that had maybe a moat around your registry set or something like that for Magic Ruler, and then all of a sudden the market gets flooded with all this sealed product, it's like, oh, that sucks, because now your cards are worth a lot less. Your registry set is a lot less unique in the world of Yu-Gi-Oh! Because all these other people are going to be able to replicate that quality of a registry set based on the availability of the inventory. Okay, so we just talked a bit about what the wilderness or the wild of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Market actually is. Now let's talk a little bit about why we find this concept so intriguing or appealing. So I think there's a couple reasons for this. Number one, it's just human nature. Humans are curious creatures. People are always interested in learning more about things that are unknown, especially things that have some dramatic or some enticing element to them. And when you talk about a market for collectibles, right, the discovery of something that is believed to be very rare or even non-existent in the case of that Cyber Dragon, right, that's really cool. Like, that's big news when that sort of stuff shows up or appears. And I think in addition to just curiosity and fascination about the unknown or things that are not yet well understood, the other element of this, to be totally frank and candid, is just interest in discovering, right, and seizing the opportunity, purchasing, buying up that collection that somebody listed on eBay that's a whole bunch of raw cards that were not yet on the market, that have not yet crossed the desk of PSA. There's a certain fascination and a certain appetite for being the person that takes those first steps, if you will, to formalize that inventory, to take it to market, to realize the actual price of that inventory. And so I think a lot of the fascination about the wilderness in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Market is that people are interested in being the first person to stake their claim on that undiscovered inventory when it does rear its head or come out of the woodwork, if you will. The other element of this, to be honest, is also fear, right? People say that fear is the unknown or whatever. And for many collectors, if you're the person that's sitting on several copies of first edition LOB Blue Eyes White Dragon, maybe you're somebody that bought a couple of these in the 2010 to 2018 or whatever time frame, where you have a pretty big position in a card that is extremely expensive for Yu-Gi-Oh! One of the things that's probably always in the back of your mind is, will some random collector come out of the woodwork who's got a binder full of these things, right? Will somebody show up who has pallets of sealed LOB First Edition Blue Eyes boxes that's going to suddenly flood the market and erode the value of my position in that asset category? So I think another reason why people are so intrigued by this concept of the wilderness is because in a market where you have volumes of cards in the PSA 10 category, for example, that are sometimes just several dozen copies of a card that's PSA 10, if somebody does discover a huge cache or hidden stash of these cards that all grade 10, that's a game changer possibly. If the total pop of PSA 10 for a certain card doubles thanks to the discovery of some gold mine, right? That's a big deal if you're a collector. And it's a game changer from both the value of your assets, from the competitiveness of your registry sets, all these other things that are on the mind of somebody that has a big position in the vintage Yu-Gi-Oh market. Okay, so we just spent a couple of minutes talking a bit about what the wild or the wilderness is in vintage Yu-Gi-Oh and why people find it so interesting or intriguing. Now, I wanted to give you some of my opinion about how big the wilderness actually is. Now, let's start just by saying, I think this is an extremely difficult question to answer. Maybe in a future video, I'll try to do a more detailed market sizing or market estimation for how large this opportunity potentially could be. But my first thought, so let's start with sealed product, because that's pretty easy to think about with respect to how much could be out there. So, number one, I think that the wild of sealed product, which is to say stuff that's sealed, that's out there, that nobody has discovered and nobody knows about, my opinion is that's a very small amount of boxes, frankly, in my opinion. We're at 2021 now. There's a lot of attention on Yu-Gi-Oh! And on Pokemon and sports cards. If somebody is sitting on a lot of sealed product and they haven't yet come out of the woodwork with it, put it on eBay, maybe for an exorbitant price, maybe it's not sold yet, but it's visible inventory. I think by now a lot of this stuff has kind of worked its way out of the woodwork, in my opinion. And I think it's important, if you disagree with me, to ask yourself, who out there would actually have this stuff in the first place? I think there's 4 possibilities. So the first would be some kind of a very perceptive collector who over the past 20 years has been doing incremental purchases of sealed product from the vintage era and been very secretive about it. So a lot of the big people that have big positions in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are quite public about what they have, or like, at least you have a sense of how the scale of their stake, if you will. They'll show like box breaks on their YouTube channels. They'll talk about how much sealed inventory they have. Obviously, they all have this stuff in banks and vaults and things like that, but folks are usually pretty transparent about some of their position or some of the stuff that they have. Now, is it possible that some of the very high-profile collectors are sitting on literally pallets of sealed product? It's possible, but I don't think it's very likely because, number one, people didn't really start waking up to the idea that this stuff could be really valuable sealed until like the mid-2010s, generally. Up until then, people were breaking this stuff open, they were playing it, and there wasn't as much recognition about the potential investment value. That's why there's so few LOB First Edition Blue Eyes relative to the Charizards or all these other things, because there's just less of them out there. A lot of this stuff got opened up and destroyed and so on and so forth. I don't need to go through all that stuff. The other possibility is that there could be some card store owner, current or former owner of a card store, that somehow has a huge stash of sealed inventory from the OG vintage era. I don't think this is also very likely because card stores have come under a lot of pressure with eBay and with the marketplace being what it is today. They have a lot of pressure to make sure they're monitoring their bottom line, trying to turn as much inventory as possible. So if you're a business and you rely on the sale of sealed product, raw cards, graded cards, odds are pretty strong that you've listed your inventory at least, or you've tried to sell some of the very expensive stuff that you have. Is it possible somebody has a storeroom full of this stuff? Sure. Is it likely? In my opinion, no, not very likely. The other possibility, to be frank, is that there are some Konami or like upper deck employees, people that were the cronies of the folks that were involved in the production of the original boxes, who were very perceptive somehow and retained for themselves a whole lot of sealed stuff. I also don't think this is highly likely for a couple reasons. Number one, people were not very perceptive back then. Nobody expected this stuff would be worth what it is today. Number two, when you're a corporation, you're driven by profit, you're driven by sales. You're not really driven by like giving handouts or, free inventory to employees typically. I know they give out like gimmicky little, gifts or things like that, or smaller products or memorabilia, but the idea that there's like some random Konami employee that was gifted or that somehow corralled influence over a stash of sealed product, I just don't see that being very likely, in my opinion. All right, number 4, folks, is mysterious origins. Now, you might be thinking, well, mysterious origins, it must originate from somewhere. Yes, it does. It must originate from somebody, whether it was a collector or a Konami person or whatever. But there's a possibility that there are storage units out there, people's attics, people's basements, garages, just random places where sealed inventory could suddenly show up in the future. It's possible, right? It is certainly possible that some person might own a whole bunch of sealed stuff and not even know that they have it buried in some storage unit or warehouse or something. So it's possible. I don't think that's also very likely. We've already seen it happen once, I think, with the magic ruler boxes that just appeared. I don't see there being a lot of likelihood for that kind of thing to happen a lot more. That seems like a real one-off, random act of just something random that just happened. So now, where things get very interesting, let's talk now about raw cards. Now, this is a totally different ball game, folks. In my personal opinion, there could be a massive market size of just unknown inventory of raw cards that are just out there in the marketplace that people have not yet listed on eBay, that are not yet publicly visible to the collector community, that are completely unknown. And yes, some of that stuff could be mint or gem mint condition, and people just don't even know it. The reason I believe this is more likely than just droves of sealed product is because everybody had raw cards. Not everybody had sealed product. So your starting point, if you will, for the market size estimate is so much larger. Everybody had some raw cards. Whether or not they were well cared for, whether or not they still exist or they got thrown away or destroyed is another question. But it's almost certain to me that there is still large pockets, gold mines, caches, treasure troves, use whatever label you want for it, of just unknown inventory. People that had a binder of just really clean, well cared for, first edition Yu-Gi-Oh cards. And I think there's probably still a lot of that out there. I know for myself, I was a very serious collector, folks, of vintage Yu-Gi-Oh from 2002 to 2004. I did not revisit my collection or send anything to PSA or even think about it until 6 months ago, which says to me, there's a lot of people out there that care about this stuff much less than I do, who have probably not yet realized the fact that their Yu-Gi-Oh products are sought after in today's market again. It's cool again, right? It's got value. A lot of people don't yet realize that or appreciate it. So all that to say, folks, I think there is a large wilderness out there of raw cards. This is why you see so many resellers and so many collectors buying up raw cards on eBay or TCG Player, because there is still a decent possibility that there's some stuff out there that's really valuable that hasn't yet been discovered, or people just don't understand what they have or what they're selling. So I think that's all here for this video, folks. I appreciate your time. If you thought this was fun or interesting, please feel free to drop a like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about the wilderness of Yu-Gi-Oh? How big do you think it is? Do you think it's mostly sealed product, raw cards? What's your opinion or your reaction to these sort of unknown elements of the Yu-Gi-Oh market today? So thanks again, everybody. Parkside Merchant. We'll see you next time.